Hello, in this episode of Airs for Architecture, the 126th, I got to speak with Gabriel Esquivel, architect and scholar and associate professor at Texas A&M University, about his book Design Technology and Digital Production, an Architecture Anthology, published by Routledge in 2023.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Airs for Architecture. I'm talking today to Dr. Gabriel Esquivel. Gabriel, we're going to be talking about your reasonably recent book, Design Technology and Digital Production, an Architecture Anthology, which you published with Routledge.
Yes.
But before we get into that, would you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, my name is Gabriel Esquivel. I'm a professor at the University of Texas A&M. So I'm a full-time professor, and this was part of something that I wanted to do for a long time, and it did take a long time to produce, but finally it is here. So I was very, very excited to see it published and all that. Yes.
Are you trained as an architect?
Yes, I was trained as an architect in Mexico City, and then when I finished my undergrad, I went to grad school to the Ohio State University in Columbus, in the U.S. And I worked for different offices like NBBJ for doing really large projects in different countries, and then I decided that I wanted to be an academic, so I left that. And I started teaching in a very interesting role because I was a professor at the School of Architecture at the same time as professor in the school and the Department of Design. So it was really an amazing opportunity to learn different things, different parts of the trades. And that really gave me a lot of perspective. It was really right at the time when digital fabrication was becoming a reality. And so I started to work on that and really create a kind of digital expertise. And then I got a job at Texas A&M. And basically, when I moved there, I was just opened the digital fabrication lab. Well, not only that, it had to do with digital fabrication, but also teaching digital design studios. And so kind of implementing the whole thing about digital design in general. Texas A&M was a little bit, they had BIM at the time, so that was part of it, what their digital sort of expertise was, but they didn't really have the kind of design part of it. So I was very lucky to be invited to do that. And so it took some time actually to get it going, but it did. And as a part of that, I think not only the fabrication part of it, which started to develop quite quickly, but also I decided to create a lab, which was called a T4T lab, which was basically an idea to invite anybody from any place in the world to come in and teach with me new ideas, whatever was new when I felt it was a kind of a new idea. Will come in and teach a semester with me, and we have a group of second-year students and fourth-year students, kind of an apprenticeship, sort of scenario. And it worked amazingly. We did it 12 times. And we had a lot of great people that now they're very sort of important and notorious. So we were kind of like very lucky to get them at the beginning. And now that would have been really difficult to get that, But it was at the right time.
Yeah.
And I think through that was really the way that I began to think about the book, because it was every year we had very interesting people, and there's a lot of new discourses and new things being developed, and a lot of conversations that were new at the time. So my interest started to grow on the fact that I wanted to connect the idea of new practices, digital practices, with the idea of theory, in the sense of how do you talk about these new practices within the frame or the discipline of architecture. So that became really my main interest. So the book emerged of that idea of thinking, okay, so how do we converge those ideas, that theory and discipline as a discipline is one thing, and maybe the digital practice is also seen as something external, or is really described more so as a process or as a kind of mechanical process, not so much as the implications that we will have directly upon the discipline. So for me, that was really the most important factor to merge those two things. So that's really in short, that was really the story of me coming to Texas A&M.
But what in practice had you seen that had inspired this turn towards the digital? I mean, were the practices you were working for, were they adopting this digital productivity, or did you engage with projects and think this is a space in which this kind of technology, this kind of thinking is evidently lacking?
No, that's a very good question, especially at the time. So the practices I was being part of were practices that were very, very large. It's a very large scale. And I had the opportunity of travel to a lot of places to work on these projects. But what I noticed was that there was a kind of hesitation to use a lot of technology, especially in design wise. And there wasn't really such a thing. It was more about, administration or organization, things like that. BIM was at the verge of kind of making it big or really being established as such. And so I felt that every time that I tried to convey that to the people that I was working with, it was like, yeah, but we have to wait. We have to make these things, happen one thing at a time. And I felt a little anxious about that. And then I was also thinking that all the effort of producing all this work was being given to the firm with no recognition, or, so it wasn't really what I was expecting to get out of. So that's what I decided, that maybe I have taught before as a kind of TA and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought, well, maybe if I go back to teaching academically or whatever, so it would be a more interesting thing to do.
Yeah.
And it was. So it wasn't that I love the practice, but I felt it was staying behind. And there were preconceptions and apprehensions that I was not going to fix myself. I knew they needed time, and I thought it was more important to work from the other side. That was really that my thoughts were.
Speaking as someone who teaches in architecture school, there's obviously the digital is how stuff is produced, and we use software and computers, but
Right.
you're not really talking about that. You're talking about, you've used the word digital fabrication, and I'd kind of like a bit of clarity about what that means. But this digital design, or design technologies you've got in the title of your book, what are we talking about when we're talking about these things? We're not talking about run-of-the-mill software here, are we?
No. So no, we were, of course, we had to do several things to actually start a digital design studio like that. So first of all, we had to create a lot of workshops and tutorials. And at the time, we were working with two softwares, Rhino at one part, and we also were working with Maya. Maya was big at that time, and Maya was what everyone was using. So we had to really become experts, or as much as possible, on Rhino on one hand and Maya. Rhino, I still use it a lot. It's a fantastic software that really, can interact with any types of files. So that was really our first idea, to start working on both platforms and start, connecting, back and forth. I wanted to not to use AutoCAD, in a sense to produce the drawings. I wanted to produce the drawings with Rhino. So there were some kind of considerations I would build around that. So I knew that there was some time to catch up. It took, a couple of semesters to actually fully develop that. So it was the idea to design a project from the very beginning using strategies, in digital softwares. And that was really, for me, the idea behind it.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a different thing. So it was not just sort of drafting digitally or introducing into Revit or things like that. So it was more so another side of it, which was specific softwares that changed and evolved through times. But at the beginning was really that kind of idea. We didn't use the word workflow at the time. So it was really kind of just switch back and forth. And that was my idea of what we should be doing at the time.
You've indicated, or you've suggested, I think, or implied that, for example, in your time in practice, there's this idea that the need for the digitization of the production of architecture is evident, but it requires an entire different way of thinking about what architectural design actually is. Am I right in thinking that? And if so, what is the kind of philosophical basis for this? Where is this coming from? Is this a kind of like post-human idea?
It came from different ideas. I felt that number one, there were several factors. One has to do with the culture of architecture within the practice itself, especially in American practices in very large offices. There was a lot of hesitation, mainly because the culture was different, and there were a lot of sort of senior designers that felt that was an invasion of their expertise and rejected that as much as possible. They used it as a documentation tool, yes,
Mm-hmm.
and they did some post-production, of course, but it wasn't really seen as anything beyond that. So it's either a construction administration tool, or it's either a representation tool or a documentation tool. And I felt that there was a huge gap on that. On my side, I had developed some smaller projects that I've done with friends, and I was using digital tools to design.
Mm-hmm.
So I realized that there was something missing, and every time I try to sort of talk about it, there was, yeah, but we need to wait, we need to see. Right now, we have a lot of work, which we did at the time, and there was a lot of pressure to get things done, and so there wasn't really a time to do that. So I felt that, and I was talking to other colleagues, and they felt the same thing, my age at the time. So it was, I thought it was a general idea, especially in the States, that there wasn't such a culture. Now it's different, but at the time it wasn't. So I felt that what I was really interested is really in trying to join those ideas. I didn't know at the time how I was going to do it and how I would think that there could be a conversion, an integration, or that kind of duality, or that kind of separate things that at the time was the practice and the academia. So if we can join forces somehow, there was a point where that could happen. And I felt at the time, I didn't know how to do it. I didn't have a strategy, but I did know that it was going to be through technology. That could be at one point the common language, the common denominator that was going to help us bridge that gap. And so that was really my interest. And as a matter of fact, this is what I told the people that interviewed me at Texas A&M, that I was interested in that. And because the school was geared at the time very much so in preparing students for the practice, they felt that that was a compelling argument from my side to do that. Although the projects that I presented, because I've been teaching before that here and there, I guess that and you mentioned that in the email that you sent me, the aesthetics were not exactly the kind of aesthetics that you will sort of use in practical projects or practice projects. But nevertheless, they trusted me and said, well, okay, go for it and do it. So that was really my goal, first as a goal of sort of merging those two ideas and experimenting more in a digital capacity, and then try to at one point or another try to come up with an idea of how we can do that, merging those things. That was really my way of thinking when I started at Texas. And so I think I've always thought that the practice is also very important. I never felt that, I felt truly that academia was where it's at and all that. So I always felt that if we don't really reach out to to the practice, we are just kind of not doing a huge disservice to both,
Yeah. And the book is centered around production, centered around the making of things and examples of the making of spatial interventions, architectural environments, architectural analysis, so on and so forth.
Yes. I think I'm a maker more than I like to think, but I like to make things. And digital fabrication was a way to experiment first digitally and think about many other things. But then that has to be turned into materials and an object and, sort of different practices. And we were able to have a really magnificent lab, which had tons of equipment. So then we can start experimenting and working with wood. We work with plastic, we work with wood, we work with composite materials, we work with metals. So it was really an amazing experience to do that. And that's when I realized that there was a possibility to do this, that the transition had to happen, maybe at the beginning with digital fabrication in kind of smaller interventions. But the idea at the time was really compelling because you would see something on the screen and then it would be a physical reality. So making became really an important factor for me to really understand that. So I think the book reflects a lot of, things about making that were, for me, really important and still are very important, right? And this is really a little bit before robots and any of that. I think at the same time, there was also in the state of Texas, there was an organization called that was really for fabrication, was an association of different schools of fabrication called TexFab. And we were different schools participating. So also we were communicating our ideas and sharing them and all that. So there was really a great moment to be doing it. And there was a conversion around that was also sending some interesting messages to the practice. And so that was really very exciting because I think we were doing, but we were also connecting, and we were also being published by, for example, Texas Architects, which is a magazine that has a lot of big distribution in Texas, and also it was mainly concentrated on the practice. So the fact that they were also showing school projects, so to speak, and then were read by these other places, they started to become interested and even sort of hiring some of our students to start the digital fabrication practices. Mm-hmm. So that made me extremely happy because I thought at least there's some kind of seminal aspects that we're working with, mm-hmm. and we're sending the message. Like I said, it was very early in the game, but it worked.
What years are we talking about here?
So yeah, we're talking about 2010, between 2010 and 2013.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I started at Texas at 2008, but like I said, that first semester was really hard. Yeah. Then the second year, 2009, we started doing, we did 3 fabrication projects at the time, but we were still not getting through, and it was kind of new. But then I think things began to happen in a different way, in 2011 to 2013, where also a lot of students wanted to do their thesis, their graduating thesis on digital fabrication and building something, which also I think it made the school very happy because I think that they were the kind of architects that will understand those kinds of things, and they would not question how you got to it, but the results were very good for them, and in terms of what they thought the education should be. So that worked.
In the book, there's this phrase that you use in the introduction. I can't remember the chapter number. I should probably have marked it down, but you make this comment about a movement from a subject-centered epistemological discourse to an ontological turn, and I thought this was very interesting. Could you perhaps a little unpack that in relation to this idea of the digital?
Yes. Well, the digital developed to a certain time, to a certain point, right? And it was until 2013 I got this essay, that was called Strange Objects by David Rue.
By whom again?
By David Rue, R-U-Y. And it was really kind of an all-revealing, for me, art essay, because it really talked about, sort of what was the condition of architecture at that time, the kind of undermining of architecture through certain digital practices that were mainly based on technology itself, and means architecture as a means of simple production. And there were tons of other things that were never considered around architecture, and I felt that was really a catalyst in my way of thinking. So I started to think and read more about it. And I realized that because my education or education at the time in architecture was very much epistemological. It was really based on knowing and experiencing things. And the discourse had diminished theoretically, because at the end of the 80s was really a big deal. Then it started dwindling a little bit. So there was really more an emphasis on, like I said, technologies and things like that. So I felt that because of my particular interest at that time also in philosophy and theory, I felt that that was really a very important thing, because we needed to revise what the ontology of architecture was, what architecture was. And it had some connections to earlier questions about, so the absolute in architecture and all that. So I felt we need to explore that. So that ontological quest began in searching for other ideas, to talk to other people. I became friends with important philosophers like Graham Hartman and Levi Bryant, and I started a conversation with them about what architecture should be, or what their thoughts were. And I tried really to implement that idea that architecture was more another type of discovery, and it was really not based on basic premises that were already established, epistemologically speaking, to be based on that. So there were other considerations that had to be sort of understood. And also the idea that there was also aesthetically, there was also another consideration, not aesthetics for the sake of aesthetics, but aesthetics in a sense of a social connection. So I think that was really the moment that I thought, okay, we know all these things digitally, but we need seriously to start connecting those, but we need to start projecting what this idea could be about the object or the objects in the world and architecture. But also another idea that convinced me very much so was part of this triple O, object-oriented ontology, was also the work of Tim Morton, that talked a lot about, sort of, or also in that work in general, about the decentering of the humans, and really understand the relationship of culture and nature, and why we as humans, putting ourselves first and foremost and on top of everything, have really destroyed the planet, and we had to deal with that. So I think it really gathered a lot of ideas about the future of architecture, what architecture is, what the message could be, how to communicate, but also how can technology be integrated in as part of this purpose. So it was a difficult sort of idea, but I think slowly but surely we began to think about it. So yes, that moment was like a complete before and after in that, in my way of thinking, and on the lab that I was working with.
So the question, I guess, that you're pushing at is well, the two questions is, what is architecture and what is it therefore to be an architect? And this
Right.
idea of destabilizing that through technology, through the rise of technology. And it's been very quick. For me, it's an interesting one because obviously as a teacher, we have to deal with AI, and we have to think about AI, and we have to think about its unwanted presence in the work of our students quite often. It's led to a discussion for us around what it is the architect offers, what it is to be an architect, and what specific thing that we can offer that digital and virtual environments can't offer. I mean, is that at the heart of what you're discovering? And as a consequence of that problem, you're proposing this kind of digital productivity as a way of kind of making space in a way for architects in the world of the digital?
Yeah, it's a complicated question because it has many areas to cover, and I think and we cannot be generalists, but we cannot only be dedicated to one thing in the way we used to.
Yeah.
So we need to be more informed in general.
Mm-hmm.
So that was an important consideration. And so technology was, as you said, developing very fast. We went from the CNC mills to the robots in no time, right? So it's really all the time was kind of trying to catch up. We were in Texas. We were not in the East Coast in the U.S. So or in L.A. So we didn't have that kind of connection to things so immediately. So we had to really strive to get things going and all that, but we did, and That was important. So for me, it started to think first. I thought that the new architect at the beginning, this is really, 2010, something like that. I thought the new architect had to be sort of a digital maker, a physical and digital maker. And that was really an important part of it. And the interaction with it was kind of to redevelop the practice in terms of understanding those abilities. But then, of course, as it developed before, you realize that there's so many other connections, right? And and then suddenly AI started. So for me, the pandemic was really a time for me to just completely get involved in AI. And I started to work, to learn a lot about it and also different ways to experiment with it. So so it wasn't diffusion models like now, like Midjourney and all that were not, sort of at the time were not popular or were they were at the verge of coming up with them, but coming out with them. But I think it was really sort of the first kind of learning about GANs and all that stuff that we started to do this. And a group of friends, the three of us, decided that we wanted to join ideas about what was at that time, or what we understood at that time, there was architectural intelligence. And we decided to focus on Serlio because all the books, the 9 books, or however many we count, 7 or 9, of Serlio were about architectural intelligence and codes. It was basically you go through the book and you see different fragments of architecture and different things, but he never tells you this goes with this goes with that, this goes with that. So it was really up to the architect's intelligence, or at least that's our interpretation of it, to kind of mix the code and really produce something. So we thought, okay, that's a really good idea for architecture and using that as an idea. So we are starting to use different technologies that were at that time associated with artificial intelligence, like Google Colab, Runway, and start to do something called the latent walks. And from the latent walks, start to kind of cut some of those moments. It's kind of a movie that kind of moves kind of weird. And we start to making those codes, those cuts, and starting to connect those pieces. And then moving also from that to, we started using Houdini. And we started voxelizing a lot of those models and all that. So it became technically very complicated, but at the same time, the interest of that is really, okay, from the idea of the architectural treatise, from the idea of architectural intelligence as defined in the Renaissance, how do we begin to evolve and join those two things to, for me, to root architecture within the discipline? So that was really the idea of this exploration that took, a year or so to produce. So, so what I was preparing for, it was really that, to be able to say AI is going to be an instrument, a medium that is going to be terribly important for academia, and it will be also for the practice. But we need to start selecting the places where it can work, and you realize what it could be useful, but you also realize that the kind of complete, sort of takeover of AI was really nowhere near. And it was really that message that we wanted to send. We need to start early. We need to make these considerations. The new architect needs to know these things, needs to be a good workflower, but also needs to understand where it's at and not really be fooled by what it's being said around. At the same time, I was thinking that was really an important target to produce and to discuss that. And we were published in AD with this particular project that we did, through Matias Del Campo, which is really a super expert on AI and architecture, and Anil Leach, which was also super great, very graceful to really help us, through this process. And so we were in constant communication with them. And so this essay and this project was released. We also did a fabrication piece, or a series of fabrication pieces that were sort of these transformations of those Serlio pieces, run through, at the time, AI. Mm-hmm. Then when the explosion of that summer, when the explosion of Midjourney and all those diffusion models, really DALL-E and all those starting to explode, we decided to go another route, and we wanted to explore the drawing first, understanding that it was producing 2D images, but it was not producing 3D images. So it's like, how can we start using this to produce 3D images, and how can we do that? So that was really an exploration. But also at the time, I had the urge to work for a large firm as a consultant, or as trying to implement the idea of, in a big practice, how can AI work? So I was able to to get a job doing that. And that was really, for me, I had a foot in academia where we were thinking about it, but I had a foot in the practice and really understanding all the things that had to be done, beginning with data collection and all those other things that had to be implemented before anything could really happen. So I realized at that moment that it's not that easy. It was not going to happen overnight. And even large firms with, sort of big budgets could also struggle with getting that going. And also, it was really a way to communicate, saying, we are in the process of really generating this is AI, generative AI at this point, and it's not really fully established. So it really needs education. It really needs all these other things beforehand. So so it was a very enlightening moment, because I was also talking to the practice, and I was talking to academia, and acting as a connector of both, sort of showing or understanding how these things can converge. So I think that was really, if I was not really working on that book also at the time, I don't think I would have made that connection.
Yeah.
Maybe. And because the book really made me realize that that connection was important. Because I think some of the things you point out in the message that you sent me, there were things that were saying, well, how do you come up with this? How did these things begin to mix? And I think it was not kind of a moment of an aha moment that made me understand that, but it was thinking that there was a lot of misinformation from one side to the other, and it was really important to become kind of an agent of both. So I still do that, and it's really what I'm interested in doing at this time, is really making those connections between AI as research, but then AI as research within an architectural firm, and develop that idea. So, in other words, to answer what you asked me at the beginning, now at the end, after all this, I was going to say that I think the most important change in the practice today would be that it needs to fully embrace the idea of research as a part of the practice that is developed in such a way that whatever the budgets are also part of this research. And it's going to be difficult to convince clients that this happens, but a lot of firms are already doing that in the UK and the US. And I think that will be an important transformation, to get that connection from academia through the practice, in a sense that big offices have to have a research component, which obviously Saha does, or Foster, or here HKS, or Gensler. They all are developing these things. And I think there's a lot of expectations placed on that, and how they will develop these research. This research will develop, but I think it will be the big step towards something interesting, and I think AI will be at the top of that research.
Thanks. You mentioned earlier this issue around a lot of the earlier kind of digital work was two-dimensional drawings, lovely images. And it is very seductive in that respect. And I think it's fair to say that it's most people's interaction with digital design is as 2D images on social media and,
Right.
design journals. What does it mean to become three-dimensional? Does it mean three-dimensional images? And I'm thinking here of, you've got these beautiful images. You've got, for example, one of the beautiful images from Young and Ayata's practice.
Yeah.
Dassault rendering, I think it is, which are very obviously two-dimensional images, but you've got other things. So I'm kind of interested in this idea of three-dimensionality, and I suppose it relates to my other question, which is, and it might sound very stupid, but what is the advantage to practice of this digital turn, of design technology and digital production? And I suppose there are examples in the book which might answer that.
Well, there are many advantages because I think there's, you have to understand the nature of how what do you want to think about designing, and I think most of those, especially the offices that I feature in the book, they are working with different technologies, and I think the understanding of that, and you can read also through the text and how important that has been in order to go to different directions, to be able to do collaborations, to work from different places, and all that. Technology has really given the breakthrough for that, right? And I think that's really what I wanted to convey also at the same time, that, and maybe the message is hidden, and this is a good opportunity, I thank you for that, to tell you why I decided to talk to these firms. And I think they all started around the same time that I did. And they started with a lot of research, with a lot of competitions, with a lot of investigations in digital technology and all that. And they're beginning to reach a point of maturity and a point where things are developing in a good way for them in terms of their practice. So the message to me is, you can start, very academically. They all teach. You can start, and they still do that. So there's a lot of these ideas going back and forth. But at the same time is really the important evolution of your work, first as generated through academia, then it developed in your practice with these with investigations and research, etc. And then until you reach the point where that is perceived by a client, and you can start having clients and really sort of being an active part of the practice. So my message was really, this is possible. Here are the examples of where they started and where they are now. And we should understand that. And this gives you the importance of going from point A to point B, in the sense that you need to do it. And it has been done, and it has been done successfully. And I think, to me, that's really the message, that it starts somewhere, but it ends somewhere else. And it produces a line from academia to the practice that sometimes people think is severed, or it's really broken, and really there isn't one. And I think not. I think there is one. And technology and research is one of them. And AI could be a great catalyst for that idea if we understand as architects how to do it, throughout the academic environment and the practice. And I think it could actually work.
You seem to be pointing towards something that I think is critically important possibility of this, of the digital turn, which is this idea of a broadly emancipatory function that it offers, which is also very challenging, I think, to knowledge systems like architecture, which are very hierarchical, almost by their nature. Is this kind of what you're proposing as well? Is this a kind of disordering of architecture away from an established hierarchy? Is that the intention, or is it really about providing the kind of practices that we've had for the last 50 years with the capacity to do new shapes?
No, I think the question is critical. No, I think it's the first. I mean, I think that what the post-digital or the second digital moment is really providing us that kind of liberation from the kind of old ideas in so many ways. So how practices are the kind of hierarchical, as you said, sort of scenarios that we go through and how it works. And also, I think what I was very influenced by was Neil Leach's digital futures, that basically, and I was very lucky to participate, doing that. And what it really taught me is the fact that there were so many kids from all over the world that love technology and were so good at it and all that. And that kind of democratization of technology was really critical to understand what the post-digital generation is, and because is now, ubiquitous to everywhere. So that sense really needs to be understood. So in a lot of ways, the kind of separation of the kind of high-end practices or neoliberal practices, or however you can call them, I think they need to learn about, that there is, the potential for a huge number of new architects that come from all places in the world with a very, very strong knowledge of the digital and with a lot of energy, and they really want to try new things. And also, I think it offers you a great possibility to embrace the artisanal. I mean, the art of doing that, the making as well. So the artisanal is really an important part of it. So I think that is the kind of new generation that has to be done. My idea of helping, other large practices to say, okay, you need to level down that idea, and by understanding the notion of the research and connecting to a new and different generation will help you also transform the idea of how we perceive things in different ways, right? The practice cannot remain as it is. It really is going to be influenced by all this technology, but also all the new generation of architects that is, they have a pervasive sort of sense of understanding and enjoying and learning technology that is going to be critical to really redefine the practice, and I never thought about that before, or was really thought maybe a little bit about it. But when I was, when I participated in those things with Neil Leach and Digital Futures, I realized that was a huge goal, and that democratization of architecture and the tools was critical. So in other words, the tools are no longer owned and by a critical important firm like it was in the past, but now they're everywhere and people are sharing them. And I think that's really a very important revolution, if you want to call it that way.
Yeah, for sure. I think we can call it that way. And I'm starting to sort of understand in a way what you mean. It's sort of like boiling a frog, though, isn't it? We've all kind of got used to this idea, for example, of everybody being creators, which is to say, in some way, design orientated, through Instagram, through the way that you position yourself on social media, through the way that you even present your own face in the virtual world, is to a large extent sort of the infusion of design thinking into everyday life for almost everybody is kind of fascinating break. But where I think your book is particularly interesting is this presentation of this idea of productivity, of the making, which has a wonderful kind of indigenous but also medieval kind of quality. This idea that you see within informal settlements, for example, in the global south and sometimes in the global north as well, but also in history. And I'm kind of interested in that as an instrument of democratization as well. Is there some kind of idea here that what we're starting to see in these practices that populate your book, that what they are proposing also has potential within the broader public realm as a means of production for a new architecture?
Absolutely. I think that's really what I want to send out this message, that that this is the beginning of their trajectory. It's so it's not over yet, by no means. So it's going to happen. And this type of offices that I just selected are just the ones that I decided to curate, but there are so many others that are doing that. Mm-hmm. And I think that is really an important consideration on how these things will develop. And I think you said something that is really quite interesting to me also, is really the connection to, you call it this medieval aspect of it, and I had some conversations with Neil Leach as well. And he mentioned that in my interest of Serlio, his interest in Alberti, and he said that it was really more about this kind of similarity that existed in the Renaissance about the idea of making, the idea of sort of combining different arts together and all that. And I think we are in a moment that we are able to do something like that And I think that kind of freedom of collaborations, that freedom of design, that freedom of the liberty of using different methods of design and workflows and all that is really an important aspect of it. And you said also another thing that is really interesting to me, which is really the idea that now my goal has been also to connect with Latin America. So especially Mexico and Colombia and Argentina, I've been working directly with these countries and different architects and schools there to also because, for example, South America has been well known for their kind of hesitation, rejection of technology. And in a global world today, when you have kids that love technology, you cannot deny that anymore. You have to embrace it. And I think it's really going to be a huge change in the way education is done globally. Not only will happen in Europe as it does now or in the States, but now also other places that are traditionally not interested in technology or there is a rejection of technology will be able to embrace that. So I think that kind of idea of technology will also help us in this kind of global understanding of what an architect does. And precisely because those countries are interested in materials and have a lot of different sort of analog techniques in the production, even of the build work, that there's also so many design decisions done during the construction process, actually like a full scale lab. I'm very interested in those kinds of things. And I think that if we can connect to that way of thinking and making, and it becomes pervasive, I think it will definitely change a lot of things. So I think it's really the way that I would like to connect this, that it really shows a trajectory for new firms to develop their practice. It's a way for us to reach out to places where making and materials and all that were really important. So can we combine that with the idea of technology in a different point of view and integrating that into the schools in a non-threatening way to all generations of professors? It's really for me, it's really something that is worth doing. So I'm also writing for those people in Argentina, the people in Colombia, doing that in Mexico, because I think there is something really important about that that hasn't reached out, whatever. So for me, the book, in many of my conversations with the editors of this book, which were, by the way, the three of them were fantastic. We talked about that and then say, well, what is the outreach? It has to reach a younger audience. And I thought, yeah, I think younger audiences are the ones that hopefully would understand the most of it, because I think it starts with an essay by Hernan Diaz Alonso, which I respect so much, and he's the director of SCI-Arc, and I think what he says there is really this kind of putting it in terms that this is for you guys. This is really what we think could happen or what think is happening. So begin to embrace that. And there's such a variety of positions, from extremely theoretical to extremely technological, to all kinds of in between, making, thinking. So that's what the chapters reflect, the great variety of things that they're all super interesting. And that's really what I believe the anthology relies on, and the idea also of technology and practice weaving in so many different ways, right? So in other words, you cannot just say, oh, well, the future is this, or the new architect will be this. It's very hard to define, but there are many, many options. And I think those options will help the profession as it is and the discipline to grow in a healthy way, or at least that's my hope.
Well, that's a great point to finish on. Thank you very much, Gabriel. I really enjoyed hearing you talk about your fascinating book.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciated the experience and all that.
There's much fear and chat around the digital in architecture, but in the real world, these are just people with ideas, as Dead Prez so perspicaciously put it. Thank you to Gabriel for taking the time, and a lot of time it was, organising to speak with me, and then doing it. And thank you, of course, to Routledge de Frankfurt for the lovely copy of the book. Please see the podcast descriptions for links to the book and to Gabriel. And thanks for listening.